R.J. Stove called César Franck the most underestimated and misunderstood of the 19th century's musical masters. Perhaps it was because he played the organ. Maybe it was his devout Catholicism at a time when music was becoming increasingly secular. Or maybe it was simply the impressionists like Debussy and Ravel who overshadowed him in the history books. Whatever the source of his lesser-known reputation, Franck clearly earned his seat among the masters. He was born in Liège, Belgium, or the Walloon district, as it was known at the time. César Auguste Jean-Guillaume Hubert Franck, there's a mouthful, grew up amidst the height of the Industrial Revolution. Liège locals called themselves têtes de charbon, or coal heads. You can imagine locomotives, large mustaches, and lamb chops. Many of the same hairstyles hipsters have revamped today. Franck's father was a quintessential stage parent with high hopes from the very beginning. The family moved to Paris when Franck was just 13, and as a teenager he studied with Reiche, the teacher of Gounod, Liszt, and Berlioz. So he definitely got a first-rate education. The relationship with his dad took a detour south a few years later when he announced his engagement to his former student, Félicité Desmousseaux. Upon hearing of this engagement, he ripped up the score to César's latest composition. César promptly rewrote it from memory. But it seems that the father, Nicolas Joseph, relied on the financial support of his son as much as the vicarious prestige. We can think of maybe Britney Spears today. But love prevailed in the end, and César and Félicité enjoyed a very happy marriage. Her parents welcomed César as one of their own, and both actors in the Académie Française, they exposed him to the new world of the theater, new to him at least. Franck's father never really recovered, and never lived long enough to hear this quartet or any of the other masterpieces we know Franck for today. For many years, Franck supported himself as a church organist. His arrangements for Sunday services became so popular that people started coming to church just to hear him. Panis Angelicus was premiered one Sunday at Sainte Clotilde and remains a favorite still today. Franck later began teaching at the Paris Conservatoire, and much beloved by his students, he became known as Père Franck, or Papa Franck. His music has been compared to Anton Bruckner's. Both men were religious, and both were pretty traditional for their time. The two great pious romantics, they both wrote on a grand scale, whether it was for full orchestra or string quartet. Both found inspiration in their faith, Bruckner writing as if he'd already found God, while Franck was often still searching for the divine. Much like Bruckner, Franck refined and personalized the late Romantic style without ever really veering over the edge. In 1874, Franck heard Wagner's Prelude to Tristan and Isolde for the first time, and it obviously left a lasting imprint. As his music changed quite a bit, he began using much more chromaticism. Some have called it erotic, others have called it mystical. But his best-known works are from this later period, including this, his one and only string quartet from 1889. It's also noteworthy that he lived through Baron Haussmann's 17-year renovation of Paris. There is some real never-ending construction. The dingy medieval city literally changed before his eyes. It was a new era in every respect, technologically, architecturally, and artistically. The Belgian virtuoso violinist Eugène Ysaÿe had been after Franck for some time to write a quartet. And in 1889, he finally produced this, his one and only quartet, which Ysaÿe and friends premiered. Ysaÿe was the preeminent virtuoso of his day, and a fellow composer in his own right. You can imagine Yo-Yo Ma if he wrote his own music. Anyway, he was not exactly a person to quibble with. A friend who attended the dress rehearsal noted that Franck had asked for a section to be played slightly differently, to which Ysaÿe replied, "Cher maître, it is I who am interpreting your work, not you, and I'll play it the way I understand it." The two remain friends, however. In this quartet, you'll hear the organ influence right off the bat, with the long sustained chords in the strings. The second movement reminds me of Mendelssohn with its light scherzando writing. And the third movement, the heart of the piece, offers long, slow cantabile melodies interspersed with passionate outbursts. The fourth and final movement rounds out the piece in Franck's signature cyclic form. You'll hear sustained chords from the beginning, return near the end. Tchaikovsky needs no introduction. His music is performed at patriotic ceremonies across the US and Russia to this day. In fact, Russian state TV recently cut to Swan Lake on the day of the Ukraine invasion. His symphonies are staples of every orchestra across the globe, and his ballets are probably performed more than all other ballets combined. Unlike many composers, Tchaikovsky enjoyed huge success during his life, first as a conductor, and then as Russia's first and only national composer. His music embodies the Russian identity. Just like the double-headed imperial eagle, the Romanov family symbol, he looked both east and west, following the European tradition of Schumann and Beethoven, while staying grounded in his Russian roots in the tradition of Glinka and folk songs. Tchaikovsky lived during a pivotal time. He came of age under Alexander II, the great visionary czar who liberated the serfs in 1861. That was 2 years before our own Emancipation Proclamation. The Industrial Revolution barreled into Russia during Tchaikovsky's youth, and business was booming. He would later attend the very first class of the new St. Petersburg Conservatory, then go on to become one of the first faculty members at the new Moscow Conservatory, which opened several years later. He was at the very forefront of the Russian tradition we know today, but no composer since has ever gained such notoriety. He remains in a league of his own. He grew up in a large family, 4 brothers and 1 sister, and was very precocious. He translated German and French by the age of 6. His governess called him Petit Pushkin, or the little Pushkin. His early piano teachers, however, were not so impressed. One suggested he would be better off as a lawyer. Much to his parents' relief, he enrolled in law school at the age of 19. He then went on to work as a clerk in the Ministry of Justice in St. Petersburg, but he kept up his musical studies on the side, and it paid off just a few years later. Tchaikovsky was part of the inaugural class at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where he studied composition with Anton Rubinstein. Shortly after graduation, he moved to Moscow, where he taught theory at the new Moscow Conservatory along with Anton's brother Nikolai. In Moscow, he really came into his own. He made astonishing progress as a composer in very little time and really relished his new bachelor life. He never really liked teaching, especially female students, it seems, but he was really popular and he was really outgoing during this phase of his life. A far cry from the wistful, conflicted, and ultimately suicidal person who wrote the Third Quartet. He'd extend elaborate greetings to total strangers on the street. Sometimes he'd sing and dance in the middle of the railway car for no apparent reason. Always bad with money, he supplemented his income with numerous arrangements and transcriptions. Tchaikovsky was a goluboy, a blue boy, or homosexual. Despite cover-ups by the Soviets and the current Russian government, it was common knowledge during his day, at least among the well-heeled set, and it's not a matter of scholarly debate. Nevertheless, in 1877, Tchaikovsky married Antonina Miliukova, his former student. Pyotr was extremely sensitive to criticism and always worried about gossip, so we can only assume this prompted him to respond to Antonina's advances. But their marriage was an absolute train wreck from day one. One guest at the wedding breakfast describes an atmosphere more befitting a wake. It seems like Antonina knew what she'd signed up for, though. Pyotr promised from the beginning to love her as a sister and nothing more. Within 2 months, they separated but never got divorced. Around the same time of his marriage, Tchaikovsky received a commission from Natasha von Meck, a wealthy businesswoman. Von Meck was so impressed with these pieces for violin and piano she'd commissioned, no doubt his other works as well, that she offered him an annual stipend of 6,000 rubles a year, which was a fortune in those days. Civil servants made only 200 to 300 a year by comparison. There was one condition, however. They could never meet. Von Meck feared no man could ever live up to the picture she'd concocted in her head. But their paths crossed just once, and it was purely by accident. No words were spoken, but no doubt Tchaikovsky saw those 6,000 rubles disappearing and promptly offered a written apology the next day for this accidental encounter. In her reply, von Meck suggested Tchaikovsky come to view her art collection, only as long as she wasn't home. They maintained a regular correspondence for nearly 14 years, and it's one of the most extensive and detailed records ever between a patron and an artist. Von Meck's arrangement eventually fizzled out. The business faltered, plus her 11 children were not thrilled at the prospect of their inheritance whittling away. But in the meantime, The new Tsar, Alexander III, took notice of Tchaikovsky. His own father had been murdered when somebody threw a bomb in his carriage. It's another story for another time. But he commissioned a cantata from Tchaikovsky for his coronation and awarded him a lifetime pension in 1884, the closest Russia ever came to an official court composer. Several years later, in 1893, Tchaikovsky attended the premiere of his Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique. He died only 9 days later, at the age of 53 years old. Rumors around his death continue to this day. Most people believe he committed suicide, though there is some considerable debate over the details. His brother Modest claimed Pyotr contracted cholera after voluntarily drinking a glass of unboiled water. Others claim the Tsar ordered an honor suicide to prevent details of Tchaikovsky's life from surfacing. He may have consumed arsenic. Whatever the reason, tens of thousands of people joined in his funeral procession. He remained extremely popular. And access to the Tchaikovsky archive at Klin has remained heavily restricted ever since. Foreigners aren't allowed. Even Russian experts can't take photos or copies outside the archive. No doubt there are more clues hidden inside. Tchaikovsky's third and final quartet veers away from the ballet and symphonic music we all know and love. This third movement especially sounds really quite different, almost religious. It was written in memory of the violinist Ferdinand Laub, who had premiered the first two quartets. This third quartet opens with a kind of elegy. The second movement you'll hear is shorter and lighter. It's a scherzo, or at least a Russian one. And then the third movement is the one that really stands out for me, recalling a Russian Orthodox chant in the middle. The piece ends on a more optimistic note, however, with an upbeat fourth movement that draws on folk tunes from Central Russia.